The world is moving very fast, in part because Donald Trump doesn't care about planning. He doesn't care about unintended consequences. His administration doesn't care about who they hurt along the way. So they're moving very fast and breaking things, as they would say in Silicon Valley. And so we need to respond with the same kind of speed, with the same alacrity, to make it really clear that there are people, in fact, in opposition, people who can provide government services and advice to the people.
If Donald Trump and the MAGA minions don't like being called fascists, if they worry that it creates a dangerous climate rife with political violence, I recommend they pause a beat and stop acting like fascists. Instead of threatening blue cities with unwanted National Guard troops and funding cuts, they might do well to take a closer look at the constructive things that are happening in major population centers and find ways to lend support that locals want and could use. Take Portland, Oregon. Trump's named Portland as a place he plans to clean up based on old pictures, very isolated incidents, and the fragile view that people there disagree with him. A closer look reveals that Portland's doing just fine, reckoning with challenges and making progress on its own, cleaning up streets by caring for its unhoused residents and taking steps to make city government more truly representative. Trump might cringe at the way people in Portland show up en masse to protest. He might rail against the steps the city is taking to push back on illegal ICE activity by revoking its land use permits. A president committed to democracy might be frustrated, but he'd also see a system working as designed. I mean, if you value democracy, and there are growing indications that Trump may not, Portland is a place to watch. And our guest, Kari Chisholm, is a great observer of Portland and how it relates to regional and national trends. He's an Oregon-based political strategist who has worked on campaigns across the Pacific Northwest and across the country for decades. He's seen firsthand how our system rewards and combats cynical lines of attack and what it takes to make progress. And like me, Kari's lived up and down the I-5 corridor, so he's thoughtful about the prospect for concerted action by the West Coast. I'm Greg Ammerfelt, and this is Pacific Time, the podcast that asks bold what-if questions about the West Coast, its challenges, and its opportunities to take action on its own. A good place to start is with setting the record straight on Portland's reputation as a protest city.
Portland's always been a protest city. George H.W. Bush famously called Portland Little Beirut when he was president. We saw in 2020, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, that Portland had an extensive period, weeks and weeks and weeks of protests, and it was often very peaceful, and then usually punctuating the evenings with some violent interaction between some self-described anarchists. That was during the first Trump administration, the tail end of it. And I think the Trump administration decided to make an example of Portland, knowing that he was not going to win Oregon in the 2020 election. And so we had some incidents, multiple incidents, unmarked, unlabeled, masked Homeland Security agents pulling protesters off the street into unmarked vans. Our Senator Wyden was very adamant that that was illegal and did some congressional investigation into that stuff. And so I'm not at all surprised that Trump is going to once again play that same playbook. It is interesting to me that so far the cities that have been where he's either gone into or threatened to bring National Guard troops into, quote unquote, do law enforcement. So far, DC, Los Angeles, Chicago, Baltimore are all cities with black mayors in states with Democratic governors. So if Portland is a target, well, we'll be the first of the ones without a black mayor, I guess. And I think what they're trying to do is to provoke a violent reaction as a way to be able to declare, a state of emergency or something and expand their powers. And it hasn't worked in LA. It hasn't worked in DC. I hope he doesn't try in Portland. And if he does, I hope people in Portland recognize it for what it is, which is an attempt to provoke. And I hope we don't take the bait.
Mayor Keith Wilson and Governor Tina Kotek have both come out pretty strongly against these pronouncements from the Trump administration. What's your read on how those defenses are going down?
Well, I mean, they're absolutely correct. It makes no sense whatsoever for him to federalize a National Guard or worse, send in National Guard from other places to do law enforcement. That is clearly a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, and it's unnecessary. There's no rampant crime in Portland. Portland's fine. It's a beautiful day today, cloudy, but like there's nothing to do here. He's complaining a little bit about the protests outside of the ICE facility in Southwest Portland. The fact is they are now sort of telling on themselves. They've said before in other cities it was about fighting crime or about sweeping the streets of homelessness. Here, they actually said it's about getting rid of the protesters. That is as blatant a violation of the First Amendment as I can imagine. We're going to bring in the military to get rid of protesters?
Yeah, and it's also interesting to situate this. Mayor Wilson was elected on a campaign that was about addressing some of Portland's urban challenges. It was my read, and in particular, its experiment with kind of unregulated and open drug use. Where does that stand? How is Portland doing at addressing its own problems?
Yeah, so we had the unfortunate effect of having gone into a drug legalization or decriminalization ballot measure that was passed without recognizing the effect that the pandemic would have and without recognizing the sort of explosive use of fentanyl on our streets. And it was, I would argue, probably not well designed in that we did the decriminalization before we got the treatment program set up. They should have reversed the order. And since then, it has since been repealed, led by Governor Tina Kotek. We've largely repealed that measure. That also coincided with a decision some years ago now in Portland to stop regulating street camping. And then that led, of course, to the Boise decision that said we couldn't regulate street camping. That's since been overturned by the Supreme Court. And so we have been dealing with the overlapping effects of drug decriminalization and legalized street camping for years now. Keith Wilson was very much elected mayor to deal particularly with homelessness and this general chaos on the streets. We're in progress. He's been mayor now for 8.5 months, is being very aggressive about tackling outdoor, unsheltered homelessness by building overnight shelters, day shelters, and recognizing that the first thing we have to do is get people off the street. Is not humane or kind to allow people to be on the streets, particularly as winter approaches. And recognizing the long-term solution is get them to housing, but the short-term solution is to get folks off the streets, get them safe, and get them warm, and then begin to offer the services they need to get into housing.
Any national official who is spotting that urban areas have complex challenges is accurate, but the idea that the resources they need are National Guard and federal agents walking the streets seems woefully misguided.
Yeah, and also it's nothing new, right? Like urban places have poverty. That's like been true forever. It's nothing new. These are ongoing challenges. They may have gotten better or worse over the years in different places, but we're working on it. Local communities are best positioned to solve these problems. You definitely don't need military intervention. Use some federal funding for, housing support. Sure.
Right. And to be clear, federal funding for housing doesn't seem forthcoming under this administration, does it?
Federal funding for most anything under this administration seems to be not forthcoming.
Yeah. So what's your assessment of West Coast opposition to this sort of blitzkrieg of federal actions under the second Trump administration?
We saw it in the first Trump administration, and we're seeing it in the second Trump administration. And this time around, it's even better coordinated. One of my former clients, who was the Attorney General of Washington during the first Trump administration, I worked for him then, Bob Ferguson, is now the governor up there. The Attorney General of Oregon, Washington, California are clearly working in a very united kind of a mode, largely with the Democratic Attorney Generals all over the country. But just last week, we saw this West Coast Health Alliance appear, where the three governors agreed that in the wake of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, under the leadership of Robert Kennedy Jr., refusing to authorize vaccines and to reversing all kinds of basic health advice that's been longstanding, creating a West Coast Health Alliance where we are saying to our residents, at least, we got you. Here's the advice. Here's how best to do this stuff. We're going to get vaccines out. Oregon's running a little bit behind right now, or Washington, California, in getting vaccines out. But that'll change as soon as the Board of Pharmacy meets. Really recognizing that if we can't count on the federal government for help, for guidance, they've got to count on our governors and our states. And it is Well, unfortunate that's where we are, but I'm really glad to see our governors come together and with a unified voice that people can trust.
It certainly is an interesting development. I mean, do you regard it as kind of a made for media announcement, or is there something really substantive there? And what will indicate to you and to the public that efforts like the West Coast Health Alliance are to be taken very, very seriously?
Well, public perception is reality in many ways. I mean, yes, it's made for media, and that's so that it gets out to the public that there are alternatives, that there are other voices that you can trust. It's an opening announcement. These things always take time. I would prefer that that they do exactly what they're doing, which is move fast, make announcements, build it as we need it, and not spend the next year, in some conference room trying to negotiate out every possible detail and plan every eventuality before announcing something. The world is moving very fast, Joe, in part because Donald Trump doesn't care about planning. He doesn't care about unintended consequences. His administration doesn't care about who they hurt along the way. So they're moving very fast and breaking things, as they would say in Silicon Valley. And so we need to respond with the same kind of speed, with the same alacrity, to just make it really clear that there are people, in fact, in opposition, people who can provide, government services and advice to the people.
So you take the West Coast Health Alliance as a very serious move. What would be your counsel to the governors on the West Coast to build on this development and to start aligning themselves in lots of other ways, either on defense or perhaps even to go on offense against the Trump administration?
Well, I'll start by saying I'm a political guy and not a policy guy. I'm a hack, not a wonk, as they say. Hacks are people who pretend to be wonks. So I won't tell Governors Newsom, Ferguson, and Kotek what to do on the policy side. I do know, though, that again, perception is reality, and people need to see that their government is capable of doing something and able to coordinate, communicate, again, provide good advice, and where possible, continue to provide services. Now, it's not possible to provide all the services that the federal government provides or has provided in the past at the state level. There's just not enough money. You think about how much you pay in taxes to the federal level and how much you pay in taxes to the state level. We all pay a lot less in state taxes than we do in federal taxes. And so there's just not the money. A lot of what the state does, what all states do, is serve as a conduit of federal money coming in. And if they're going to just pull the plug on some of that federal funding, those are just shortfalls. That said, when we talk about state government, county government, local government, they're closer to the people. They can see the problems. They can react nimbly if they're willing to do so. A lot of times right now, we need to sort of recognize that what we have to do is act fast, be nimble, set aside perhaps some of our longstanding desire to plan and negotiate and sort things out over time and just react as fast as the Trump administration is acting.
From a political perspective, from the perspective of a hack, as you said, what are the hot button issues in the mind of the public on the West Coast that present real opportunities for governors to act if the feds will not?
Well, on the defensive side, it's all this sort of immigration and law enforcement, the National Guard stuff, the way that they're just creating chaos all the time. On the proactive side, the big challenges on the West Coast are largely housing. We're really struggling to have enough affordable housing for folks. Now, the reality is that you can't build enough housing provided by the government at any level in order to make a dent. There's not enough money in the pockets of the taxpayers, much less in the budgets of governments, to build all the housing that we need. So it really is a matter of how do we unlock private investment in housing. On the West Coast, we have been fortunate that we have been a place where people want to move. They want to come here. And in a lot of communities, that's meant figuring out ways to slow down the influx or manage it in ways, put the new people here, put people there. Oregon, of course, has an urban growth boundary system that does a lot of that. But the problem now is when we've restricted the supply of housing so dramatically, it has caused, of course, the price of housing to go up. Portland is more affordable than Seattle and the Bay Area, Los Angeles and San Diego. But we're also feeling the pitch, and it's a major, major issue here in Portland as well. Now, a lot of what I'm doing these days is working on trying to reduce the cost of housing by unlocking the private market and in a very progressive way, making sure that people who want to invest in housing in this community are able to do so, and help flatten the curve on the cost of housing.
While we're on it, I mean, I agree with you. It does seem like housing and by dint of housing affordability are the major issues up and down the West Coast. That just keeps coming up. We've seen in California relaxation of longstanding environmental rules that are getting in the way of housing development. Have there been other developments that you think point to positive trends in terms of unlocking the housing market?
Well, in Portland, for example, one of the ways we fund building services is through systems development charges. So if you're going to build a new apartment building, there's a fee that you pay that's to pay for transit or other transportation, sewer, water, parks, those kinds of things. Those systems development charges can be a lot, as much as $20,000 or $30,000 per unit of housing. And just last month, the city of Portland, with its very progressive city council, decided unanimously to suspend those systems development charges for a 3-year period, to say, look, one of our problems right now is literally nobody building housing in Portland. So we're not going to collect those fees anyway if there's nobody building housing. So how about we freeze the fees for a while, get people building housing again. We'll collect property taxes on the housing as well, but most importantly, just jumpstart the housing economy, get people back to work, building things, and begin to make a small dent in the cost of housing.
Nolan Leinhart, the urban planner who based in Portland's, encouraged people to get bolder with their public projects. What are the Hail Mary passes that policymakers and even business leaders could be contemplating in order to unlock housing further?
Well, there's housing, but then there's also getting the economy back on track, right? And in Portland in particular, folks across the country often think of Portland and Seattle as being fairly similar, or Portland as being the younger, smaller sibling, the Seattle, but they're very different economically. Seattle is a city that has Microsoft and Boeing and Amazon and Costco, other large corporations. Portland doesn't. We have 2 Fortune 500 companies, Nike and Precision Castparts. As a result, Portland is very much a small business town. The analogy I use all the time is, when the hurricane comes, Seattle has big aircraft carriers that just kind of keep cruising, whereas Portland's a town full of little sailboats that get tossed around on the angry seas. We are the first ones into a recession and the last ones out, and so we need to do things in Portland to, as the economy starts to falter a bit, as tariffs really do a number on our export dependent economy here, to get things back on track. And if I can just talk about a couple of examples that my firm's been working on to bring tourism back, to connect the urban places with the rural places. We've been working to help build something called the James Beard Public Market. Seattle has Pike Place Market. Portland is gonna follow suit, only about 100 years too late, and build something called the James Beard Public Market right downtown. The state has provided funding. The city has provided funding. Construction is underway now. And sometime next year, we're going to open that up, and we'll have, Oregon agricultural producers bringing products to downtown Portland to a beautiful new public market where folks will be able to visit from all over the world. By the same token, we're talking right now about a brand new performing arts center in Portland. Our current Broadway style theater, the Keller Auditorium, is old. It's going to fall down in an earthquake. And so Portland State University has proposed building a brand new performing arts center, Broadway capable, modern, acoustically tunable auditorium just a few blocks away. And we're actively working on trying to make that project happen. It'll be a partnership between the state, between the city, private philanthropists, and the university to pull that together. It's a long way from coming together, but if we're successful, it'll open in 2030, 2031, and we'll redevelop an entire part of downtown. The entire south end of downtown Portland will redevelop as a result of that. Housing, commercial activity will all crop up around a brand new Broadway theater.
Those are great examples of what I think Nolan Leinhart was referring to, and he talked fondly about what he'd seen in Nashville, that their investments in the performing arts and culture had played a huge role in kind of revitalizing the identity of people who live there, but then making it a draw for people from around the country to come visit and think about doing business there too. So it's great to hear about projects like the Beard Market and the theater at Portland State. Let's connect Portland to another big national trend, which is election reform and redistricting. Redistricting has been in the news with the move by the Texas legislature to gerrymander, to reapportion 5 of its congressional seats from democratically held districts to Republican-leaning districts, with Governor Newsom in California responding in kind and putting a ballot initiative on the November election in California to redistrict five districts in California toward the Democrats. You, Kari, have been very closely involved in local redistricting efforts. Can you describe the experience you had?
Yeah, sure. So in Portland, for 100 years, we had a form of government with a mayor and 4 city council members. In the 2024 election, we changed that. A charter reform measure came through. And in 2024, we elected a 12-person city council with a mayor. Those 12, instead of being elected citywide, are elected from 4 districts. So they are 4 multi-member districts with a ranked choice voting system behind it as well. I was on the 13-person independent districting commission that drew Portland's first ever district maps. We took months to do. The 13 of us was probably the most diverse group of people I've ever been part of, through gender and ethnicity, but also from where we were in the city, our occupational backgrounds, our ages, our approaches to the work. And it really was a conversation about what are communities of interest. It wasn't partisan. Everyone at the Portland City Council that we just elected are Democrats. 12 out of 12 are Democrats. There's not a partisan way to cut the maps in Portland, but it was about trying to understand what is community, and what does it mean to try and ensure representation for previously underrepresented communities in Portland. So all the way down to, if you think about the big picture of drawing up the city, all the way down to little, like, going block by block, and should this district move here around this community center, around that church? Should it map to this school district boundary or along this freeway? And that sort of thing. It's a very detailed work, but very detailed work based on very big principles. I loved it. I'm a map nerd. Wasn't partisan in the way that we're talking about right now with Texas versus California and all that.
Okay, so what you just described about what's happened in Portland, I mean, they talk about states being the laboratories of democracy, but holy cow, Portland seems like it's really the laboratory. I mean, everything from expanding the number of districts to multi-member districts to ranked choice voting, all in one package. Let's talk about that first, and then I want to circle back on the process for getting there. What are you finding, and what are people in Portland finding about all this democratic reform?
But we have, because of the districts, we have a part of East Portland, east of I-205 in Portland, where for 100 years, we had only elected 2 members of the city council. There are 3 who had actually served from that area in a century. And then in 2024, because we made that a district, 3 were elected in this election, and there'll be 3 going forward, I suppose, until they change the maps. And it's been exhilarating to watch as a person who was part of the initial, very first day of that district commission, saying, I was the one who said, I think we need a district that is east of 205. And I was not the only one with that idea. It was the first thing we agreed to it unanimously. And sort of envisioning, like, what would that mean in terms of representation for that community? And then to watch these counselors actually, first of all, they ran as candidates in that area, talking about how they're going to serve the community. And then they get elected. For example, Councilor Loretta Smith proposed a sidewalk pavement plan to put sidewalks in a number of the neighborhoods in that community that don't have them. To see that representation actually come into effect is extraordinary to watch. Broadly, with 12 council members and a mayor, we also seen with the single transferable vote in multi-member districts concept. It means that you can get elected with 25% of the vote plus 1. And so that has meant that the councilors that have been elected represent a fairly diverse range of ideological positions, all on the left. It is Portland, after all. As I said, they're all Democrats. But the range from sort of pragmatic, moderate, sort of business-friendly Democrats all the way to Democrat socialists. They've been wrestling with a lot of the policy questions in a new way that we haven't seen before in the city of Portland, when before it was 50% plus 1 and elected citywide. And so you tended to have folks who had broad support from across the city, and in particular from the business community and others who were sort of like have power in the city. And so power has been redistributed. In some ways, that's a good thing. In some ways, it's made governing a little more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, my sense about a number of these election reforms, wherever they're attempted, is they're meant to create more representation, which by definition means there's going to be more confrontation when it comes to governing, and yet it puts the priority on consensus building. And it sounds like that's exactly what's happening in Portland so far.
Exactly right. And the folks who are particularly on the socialist side of things are sort of saying like, hey, we're finally getting our chance to have power. At the same time, I think there are a lot of folks in the city, particularly in the bureaus, who are sort of a little bit not sure how to react. They've been used to decades or a certain kind of governance, and now things are sort of a bit a kilter. Again, that can be a very good thing. Change is a good thing. New ideas are a good thing. At the same time, it is, I think, then incumbent upon the new council, everyone from the different perspectives, to figure out how to work together to engage in the tough, hard policy work of governing and leaving behind the campaign slogans and sort of social media driven fist fighting. That is a great way to get elected, but it's not a great way to govern.
So let's talk about the process of making that happen and your work with the independent commission. What are your reflections on that? What are the lessons learned from that process? Like, I can't imagine, while you reached a unanimous consensus about the outcome, I imagine that there was quite a bit of conversation leading up to it.
Yeah, again, on the district commission, when you're drawing maps, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out, again, what is community? And for example, in Portland, generally speaking, you don't find pockets of ethnic communities sort of all gathered in one place. We have a group of traditionally Black neighborhoods. But when you actually look at where Black people live in Portland, they're actually spread out across the city, particularly across the north and the east. Same with Latino communities. So around the J District is this Asian American community. And the question is really, do we want to divide that district into two pieces or put them into one district? And in fact, Apano, the advocacy organization that works to represent Asian American families in Portland, said, we'd actually prefer to have that dense area of Asian Americans in Portland divided into two districts so that we have the ability to communicate and ask for representation from the council members from both districts. We want to be able to turn to 6 rather than 3 council members, which is an interesting part of the conversation. A big part of the conversation around the mapping was also around renters. And this is where I actually lost the fight that I wanted to do, which there's a whole section of Portland, for those that know Portland, along Sandy Boulevard, that has rapidly become one of the densest parts of the entire state. Lots and lots of 5 and 6 story apartment buildings. And downtown Portland is also loaded with apartment buildings. And I thought the smart thing to do would be to take the entire west side and pair it with this sort of stretch of apartment buildings along Sandy Boulevard and generate what would effectively been a renters district. Other folks thought that no, we should instead pair downtown Portland, which is perceived as being wealthy, although most of the wealth is in the businesses, not in the residents, and pair that with a sort of a suburban, wealthier community in Southeast Portland called Selwood, Eastmoreland. And so that's what ended up happening. I lost that fight. But it was nonetheless constructive conversation about what does community mean? How does representation best happen?
I just listening to you talk, I mean, it's so inspiring. I mean, both the process and the result, it just seems like this is what democracy is: actively participating, actively wrestling with how to make sure people are represented and get what they need in order to function, in order to live, in order to work, all the things. So congratulations to you and the board and to the city council on quite an achievement. Do you feel like you've defined a playbook that other West Coast cities or even West Coast suburbs and rural areas could follow?
I'm a big believer in independent districting. Washington and California have independent districting. California, it's very much like what we did. An independent group of people chosen, just to pull together. Washington has a districting commission that is a bipartisan commission, which is often described as politicians cutting deals, as opposed to what California has, which is independent, jurors, if you will, figuring out what's best. I like independent districting. I wish every place had independent districting for their legislatures and for Congress. But we live in a world right now where blue states have pursued the good government ideal of independent districting, and red states have largely not. And they've chosen to stick with partisan districting, often race-based districting in the South. And in this world right now where Congress is evenly divided, even though the votes for Congress across the country are not evenly divided. Democrats win way more votes for congressional seats than Republicans do, and yet Republicans control the House. And that's largely due to gerrymandering in red states. And so if Texas is going to go further and push the needle even further, then I think the correct thing to do is what Governor Newsom is doing, which is to say the goal is not a balanced congressional delegation state by state. The goal is to have a balanced congressional delegation across the entire country. And if Texas is going to put its thumb on the scale over here, we got to put our thumb on the scale over here. And that's how you balance things back out. Every Republican in Congress that is complaining about what Gavin Newsom is doing voted against a ban on partisan gerrymandering presented just a couple of years ago in Congress. Yes, we should get rid of partisan gerrymandering. We should get rid of partisan districting. And we should do it everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me that at a national level, we're experiencing the Cuban Missile Crisis of American democracy. And the question is, what is going to cause our elected leaders to walk back from the brink? What do you think that could take, Kari?
I don't know. We've gotten into this sort of tit for tat revenge mindset. And certainly this president is not one who's going to walk back from the brink. He, in fact, seems to want to push it further and further. He doesn't seem to care about the long-term consequences of his actions, either in terms of policy and how it affects people, or about or what's going to do to our democracy. Right now, I think it's critical that the Democrats push back, fight back, and find ways to slow this down and to put obstacles in his way. We're not going to win every fight. In fact, we're losing more than we win right now. But just the act of fighting and saying no and putting obstacles in place and challenging things in the courts is important to do, even if it means along the way you'll lose a bunch of the times.
I mean, this is a president who sees himself as a deal maker. Is there a grand bargain to be found where West Coast states offer some economic sacrifice in order to insist on election reforms around the country?
Maybe, although he doesn't seem to have been a deal maker recently. On the tariffs, for example, he keeps saying, I want to make deals with other countries. And the other countries are like, yeah, whatever, go away, dude. Because they understand the economic impact this is going to have on Americans. They believe he's in a cave. Trump is actually, as it turns out, a pretty terrible deal maker. And so, no, I'm not sure I'm at all confident that there's a deal that could be made, in particular because he's always undermining the deals that are made. In a world, for example, just talk about federal budget politics, in a world where he claims he can just not spend money that Congress has appropriated, he can just eliminate agencies that Congress has not eliminated. How did Democrats in Congress cut any kind of a deal with him? Because the deal would be, okay, well, you protect these programs and we'll let you have these cuts. Well, if you let him have these cuts in exchange for protecting certain programs, and then he kills the programs anyway, there's no way to have a deal. And he's demonstrated he's an untrustworthy negotiating partner.
Okay, so we're shifting into kind of the national political scene over the next few years. I mean, do you believe that a swing toward the Democrats in the 2026 midterms and then a Democratic president in 2028, that those are the only two ways to reverse the damage that Trump is doing in this administration?
They're the best way, for sure. And frankly, there'll be states where we win governorships and legislatures as well that perhaps we weren't expecting. Kansas has had Democratic governors repeatedly since Sam Brownback was the governor, 15, 20 years ago now. And Sam Brownback was very much Trump for Kansas, what Trump is now nationally, ripping programs apart, defunding everything, slashing taxes. And Kansas, a very red state, has had Democratic governors almost continuously since then. In 1994, California was still a swing state in the legislature. Had elected Republican governors repeatedly, not just Reagan, but others as well, Dick Bajan and Wilson. And then in 1994, They ran the anti-immigration measure, Prop 187. Ever since then, Democrats have had supermajorities in California. We've looked at every single governor in California, with the exception of Arnold Schwarzenegger, who got in a nonpartisan election and behaved and governed very much as a sort of a nonpartisan governor. So these things do have long-term impacts. And you asked the question, like, what's going to take to get, to turn things around? And the fever has to break. That may require a big wave election for the Democrats. It may frankly require Donald Trump passing away. I'm not calling for anything. I'm just saying that, he's an old man, and when he goes, he will no longer have the power over his party that he has today.
Are there other political developments that you're monitoring, keeping an eye on, that you think could be really important to the upcoming elections?
I think we need to pay very close attention to states that we have historically not thought of as being winnable. In Iowa, for example, in the U.S. Senate race, Joni Ernst has been seen as sort of unbeatable. She made some poor comments about, we're all going to die. And Iowa farmers have been absolutely devastated by these tariffs. A poll comes out, I think about 10 days ago, that showed her losing to a state senator, a young guy named Zach Walz. 3 days later, she dropped out of the race. And so I think that this U.S. Senate race in Iowa is suddenly on the map. This morning, James Tallarico announced he's running for the U.S. Senate in Texas, joining Colin Allred in the race. Tallarico is the son of a Baptist preacher, progressive, but speaks in a way that connects with religiously conservative audiences. Maybe he beats Allred in the primary, maybe he doesn't. But Texas is an open primary state. Senator Cornyn is facing a primary challenge from the right, and you move a bunch of Democrats out of, historically in Texas, a lot of Democrats will vote in the Republican primary because Democrats usually only have one candidate on their side. They've cleared the field. And that tends to make the sort of more reasonable Republican win. Cornyn can't count on that now. If there's a very competitive race for U.S. Senate in Texas on the Democratic side, Allred and on Tallarico, Cornyn may lose that primary to the Attorney General there. And that might set up then a Democratic win in Texas in November. We can't assume that any place is safe because Donald Trump has proven only to be able to win votes for himself. He has never proven to be able to win votes for other Republicans. When Donald Trump is not on the ballot, Republicans do very poorly in the Trump era, in both the first Trump administration and the current one. You won't be on the ballot in 2026. And so I expect Democrats to do very, very well.
That's a really interesting perspective. I'm noting quite a lot of hand-wringing in traditionally liberal media about why the Democrats lost the last election and enabled Trump's win and the turnover of the House and the Senate. What's your read on what the Democratic message has to be in order to turn things around in the upcoming elections?
Well, first of all, just don't be Trump. People don't appreciate the chaos. Whether you might support him on some of his policies here or there, the way he goes about it, this sort of chaotic approach, has real impact on real families. The Doge approach that we faced all spring of just slashing places, and then you see Trump voters all over the country saying, "Wait a minute, I didn't vote for this. I didn't vote to for my these people to be deported or for this government program to be wiped out. I didn't even know that was a government program that I was relying on so badly." All across the country, people are discovering that Medicaid has a different brand name in every state. In Oregon, it's the Oregon Health Plan. In California, it's Medi-Cal. And people are discovering that they were in favor of cutting Medicaid because it's just, healthcare for poor people. It turns out it's for themselves. They shouldn't realize it, that's the program they were in. You asked them about the message for Democrats. Part of it is Joe Biden's message from 2020. Stability, stop the freak out all the time. And then the second is to recognize that Trump got elected the second time around on a promise of affordability to make life cheaper for people. And everything he's done since then has been the opposite. And so Democrats can be, as they always have been, the party of affordability. Affordable housing, affordable healthcare, affordable childcare, affordable groceries. That would be a topic. But we need to make sure that what we're doing is we're helping people live their lives in a way that they can survive. And it's just as basic as that. And then get rid of all the chaos and nonsense that seems to follow Trump around.
I was also noting, Gavin Newsom, I think, has been riding a wave of popularity as one of the more prominent, sort of people in opposition to Trump. His social media team doing an incredible job of mocking Trump's tone and words. But yet, as conversations start to shift toward the slate of candidates for 2028, Newsom's painted as a quote unquote West Coast liberal. And I think Kamala Harris labored under the same impression. There's a perception problem for really strong leaders from the West Coast in facing this West Coast liberal notion. And, it's associated with advocacy for trans rights and protections for abortion and other things. How would you help a candidate like Newsom overcome that perception problem?
California has always been about the future. And that's in all the ways that people are excited about, technology, iPhones or computers or, medical advances. It's also been about the future when it comes to things that people get a little nervous about. Social liberalism, right? San Francisco for many years was sort of, to say San Francisco and you knew people like gay people, right? San Francisco liberal was a epithet in the 80s. I think Gavin Newsom or any leader from the West Coast needs to sort of just own that and say, yeah, we are about the future. And we are about making it so that people and everybody is welcome. And I think you can't be afraid of it. You have to sort of accept it and use it as a strength. I would say it again. James Tallarico in Texas, who announced this morning for the U.S. Senate, had a line in his announcement speech where he said, he was talking about his religious faith. He called it a barefoot rabbi. He was Jesus Christ. Says, the only two commandments: love God and love thy neighbor, because you cannot love God unless you love your neighbor. That is a very progressive idea, that the job is to love your neighbor. It's not at all how Trump behaves. And frankly, a lot of the evangelical supporters of Trump behave. And so I think this idea that what's going on here on the West Coast is somehow unusual or weird or not in line with the cultural or social norms of the rest of the country is just wrong. Love thy neighbor. It's as simple as that. And we've got to find ways to be very comfortable saying that as Democrats. We tend to shy away from religious talk. I'm not a religious person, but I recognize it has enormous value for a lot of people where they sort of center their personality, their identity, and their values. And we got to find ways to talk in a value-based way that connects with people. We're not trying to make affordable housing affordable because we don't like landlords. We want rent to be cheap. Housing needs to be affordable because housing is the center of a family, and families are the bedrock of community. If kids grow up in a community and then can't afford to live near their families and they got to move away, you start ripping apart the fabric of a community. That's why we care about affordable housing. And so we got to find ways to talk about the policy prescriptions that we're pursuing in value-driven ways that really connect with people's core identities.
So we're talking about a best case here from a liberal perspective of changing the message and turning the tide on Trump's politics. But there's an alternate scenario, which is that things are going to get a lot worse in the next 3.5 years, and that the elections may not go the way of restoring democracy and the constitutional order. Let's get into some hypotheticals along those lines. A recent episode focused on polling out of California that found that 72% of Californians favor the idea of California enjoying special autonomous status inside of the next 2 years, and went further to say, here are 13 legal ways for California to start acting on its own. How would you approach a campaign for California to achieve special autonomous status? What argument would you have to make and win?
Yeah, the phrase people are using a lot is soft secession. The idea that there are things that we could do, Oregon, Washington, California, other states, New England, to begin to pull away. I am very intrigued by the idea. I've been thinking about it a lot. I'm not sure I support it entirely yet. It becomes challenging because right now, it's all about where you got to follow the money. And if you want to build programs, you got to fund them. And right now, as I said earlier, you send a lot more money to Washington, D.C. than you do your state capital. There's not a way really to redirect that. I keep having friends say to me, like, well, can't Oregon just say we're not going to send our money? Well, the money doesn't flow through the state. I don't pay my taxes to the state. The state sends the federal taxes to D.C. The money is pulled out of my salary, my paycheck, by a payroll service that operates nationally and sends it to, DC every paycheck. And so from a pure mechanical standpoint, there's not a way to do that. Frankly, from a legal standpoint, you would have to have the federal government in some way bestow that special autonomous status in whether policy by policy or in a broader sense. The federal government would have to bestow that, provide that to the states. You asked earlier if Donald Trump is a deal maker. I think an interesting question would be, is there a deal to be made with Trump or the Trump administration or Republican Congress that in fact says, these services are going to go back out to the states. These policies, these programs go back out to the states, and with it, the money. And not just that we're going to send money to the states from the federal budget, which is what we do now. That's how we operate most of the programs that we do today. It's federal government sends money to the states, states operate it. But rather, we're going to cut taxes dramatically and then let states raise taxes in return. On some level, that's appealing. Let high service states raise their taxes, let low service states have lower taxes. That is, of course, the Republican conservative, almost a right-wing dream of the last century, is devolution of power. It's what Grover Norquist used to talk about, the anti-tax advocate. That's why there might be a deal to be cut there. At the same time, it's also pretty scary. It says to Americans what privileges and what services you qualify for, depending on where you live, depending on your zip code. It is very much, if this is the thing I worry about any sort of soft or hard secession, is we're abandoning people in red states who don't want this to happen. In the bluest of the blue cities, Portland, Oregon, for example, Donald Trump got 25 to 30%, depending where you're looking. In the reddest of red states, Kamala Harris got 25 or 30% of the vote. This is a purple country, and it's just shades of purple. And so if we're going to say, we draw lines at state boundaries and say, here you get healthcare and public education and, social services, and here you don't, then aren't we just abandoning people? And I don't know the answer to that, because I also know that it can't be true that we're going to eliminate the services everywhere because the president doesn't want to do them. If Trump's going to just start gutting higher education, gutting public education, gutting healthcare services, then yeah, I'd like my state or a collection of states where I live to provide those services. But I'm also really sort of troubled with it. We'd say, well, but if you live in Texas or Tennessee or Florida, you're out of luck.
Yeah, it's a really interesting notion. And if you go down that path, what role does federal tax and the federal government continue to play? I mean, in my mind, there's no need for several state or regional militaries. The idea of maintaining a united military for protecting American borders and interests abroad seems to make sense. But you mentioned healthcare, and it's very interesting, and we're watching a case in that in real time right now. Not only were the West Coast governors creating this health alliance in reaction to RFK Jr. hollowing out vaccine guidance from CDC, but we watched the state of Florida basically end vaccine guidance in a way that doesn't just impact Floridians. That could lead to the spread of measles and other diseases across state boundaries very easily. And so it is an interesting moment for us to look at, what are the flashpoints that could say we actually need to take responsibility and have the funding to take responsibility for things that we consider vital in the operation of our society, however those boundaries get drawn.
Well, and vaccine guidance is an easy one, right? It doesn't cost anything really for a state government to say, this is the list of recommended vaccines. Because the vaccines, once they're on the recommended list, are provided by your medical provider and paid for by your insurance company as a preventative service. Vaccines are one of the cheapest interventions we can do, right? A few bucks to jab you saves you thousands and thousands of dollars in healthcare. But the insurance companies have always relied on a government agency, federal or state, actually it's actually always state, but with federal guidance, to tell them what's the list. And so when Florida says there's no more list, so the insurance companies are pushing it like, well, does that mean we don't have to pay for this anymore? It'd be unwise for them to stop paying for vaccines. Again, vaccines are a very cheap intervention. But again, vaccines are an easy one. Medicaid, healthcare for poor people, is extremely expensive. We all pay taxes. You see it on your paycheck every week, what you pay for Medicaid. And unless you're low income, you don't get it, right? It goes out to the entire country to states, usually in block grants. And states then manage those healthcare programs. Trump's cutting them, slashing them. We don't know what's going to happen. The state of Oregon is looking at, hundreds of millions of dollars lost in Medicaid funding, which, we're going to have to, as a result, eliminate healthcare for some group of people or for some set of ailments. And it's, tragic. People will die because of Trump's budget. And you're seeing Republican members of Congress freak out and, as hospital directors in their community say, we're going to have to close because 40% of the people in this community are on Medicaid. You're seeing Republicans start to backpedal and try and fix it, but they caused the problem.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic. How to think about a responsible devolution of responsibility from the federal government to states or regions. Is the role of the federal government about setting standards that every state or region needs to maintain, and then having enough funding available to plug gaps where possible, and in the meantime, as you say, high service states probably would be all too happy to just keep those funds and apply them to programs that they know work well for providing health coverage to their citizens. Are there other policy areas that you think are interesting to mull in terms of a changed role for federal and state government?
You can pick and choose, right? And just say, again, in a way that's very 1980s Republican, say, okay, we're going to eliminate, for example, the Department of Education, and we're going to eliminate all funding for K-12 schools that comes from the federal government, and you all figure it out on your own. That's a very 80s Republican kind of way to go about it. You could also imagine a world where you go all the other extreme and say, let's actually eliminate all of it. And again, I'm not proposing this. I'm very clear about that. I'm not a secession guy, but I've been doing a lot of sort of thought experiment stuff. Like, what if we were doing, you said the other day, we wouldn't want to have multiple militaries. I can imagine a scenario where it's like the European Union, right? A bunch of independent countries, but do come together in a European Parliament to do some joint governance. You would have free travel between those American republics. You'd probably want to keep the dollar, single currency. You'd probably want to have essentially one economic system. That means keeping the Federal Reserve going. You, I think, would want to have one military that controls the nuclear stockpile. That means a commander in chief. And then you have to have a governing body that then governs that. Does Congress look different somehow? Is it a federation of the new American republics? How many of them are there? Is it 50? It's probably not 50. 5, 6, or 7 new American republics. This week on at least Threads, if not other social media, people have been arguing about whether the West Coast should be called Pacifica or Cascadia. I don't have a preference either way. It's an interesting thought experiment. What would it look like to truly break up the United States in the Great American Divorce, and to find a way to do it peacefully? Because to me, that's the most important part here. Is how do you get from here to there peacefully? Then what's the interaction of them to each other? What's the relationship of them to each other in that future world? And then how do you govern individually? If you had, for example, a new nation that was Oregon, Washington, California, let's call it Alaska, Hawaii, and Nevada, what would that look like? Again, I'm not supporting that. I'm not proposing it. It's a thought experiment that leads you down some interesting paths when you go down there late at night, maybe with a pitcher of beer. But it also means to sort of illustrate, to me, the incredible power of the American experiment. This thing that we've had for 235 years, the most diverse country on earth in all the possible ways. And we've managed to govern together for 235 years, not always successfully. It has been far worse than it is today before, Civil War in particular. And we've always come through it. And the question becomes like, how do we break the fever of Donald Trump? How do we get the people around him, people who support him, who many of whom are serious policy people, but are right now acting as if they're not, because he is not. And they're sort of chasing his every whim. It's the guy who would be an emperor, and he just, ruled by edict and by whim. And right now he's forcing the Republican Party to follow him all over the map. The Republican Party used to be the free trade party. Now they're the tariff party. It makes no sense. And so they used to be, the party of, we're going to stand up. We need our guns because we're going to stand up to, government oppression. And now there's actual government oppression. Where are they? Donald Trump is clearly the most powerful personality that's ever sat in the Oval Office. How he managed to pull it up, I don't know. I don't get it myself. I don't understand the appeal. But he clearly appeals to a lot of people, so much that the politicians in his party are terrified of the people who support him. We got to find a way to one, take back the power, two, prove that we can govern in blue states and do it effectively. Because I think part of the reason why Trump exists is because blue states and blue cities have not been governing effectively. And he came in and said, I can fix it. And then once the fever breaks, begin the process of rebuilding our country.
Yeah, Kari, you use the word thought experiment, and I've been asked the question: is this podcast a thought experiment or a sign of something to come? And I think it all hinges on whether or not the fever will break, whether support for Donald Trump and his seemingly very destructive policies continues or not, and if it doesn't, whether we need to have some pretty clear ideas about, you name it, maybe it's not secession, maybe it's soft secession, but an alternate way to approach governance in this country that brings us back to something sensible. It will be an interesting couple of years for sure.
It sure will. I think it's going to be an interesting place to do politics and figure it out. And I love living on the West Coast. I love living in Oregon. I have always loved it here. I am hopeful that we're going to turn the corner.
If this conversation makes one thing clear, it's that democracy does not protect itself. On the West Coast, we're watching in real time as states and cities like Portland take aggressive moves to get more citizens involved and to address their biggest challenges. A few takeaways stand out for me from my talk with Kari Chisholm. 1, waiting for Washington, D.C. is a dead end. State and city level reforms on ballots, representation, and election design are where sovereignty begins. Portland shows us what's possible. 2, leaders on the West Coast have an opportunity and maybe an obligation to show the country that democracy can be reimagined, not just defended. It may not be too soon to imagine the country that the West Coast wants to be. So here are a few questions I'll leave you with. What's it going to take for the fever to break so that enough Trump supporters recognize he's driving the country off the cliff? And if he keeps heading that way, what kind of parachutes do we need to make ready to land in the right place? Thanks as always for being with me in Pacific Time. I invite you to follow, like, and share this podcast with your friends, family, and neighbors. Join the conversation on the socials, and let's keep our chins up by asking what if questions together. See you next time.